Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Wilfred Reilly. Will, welcome to the show.
Glad to be on. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you back on, and I want to talk to you about Black Lives Matter. You wrote a brilliant piece for us on the 5th anniversary of the death of George Floyd. I don't know if it's surprising or not that it seems that long ago, but it's been 5 years and a lot has happened since then. So it's a good thing to look back on and ask ourselves what was going on there. What was that all about? What were the consequences of it? So take us back to 25th of May, 2020. We saw this image of George Floyd being kneeled on by a cop and it shocked people around the world. What were your initial thoughts when you saw that? Before everything exploded and before the streets blew up, what did you think when you saw that happen?
Yeah, when I first saw the George Floyd video itself, I think I had the same reaction that most people did, which is, this is police brutality. You know, you didn't see any of the background at first, so there's just a cop, a police officer kneeling on the back of another male. And, you know, he's there for a while and the guy is screaming and shouting and so on. And my assumption was that there'd be some kind of investigation in that city. I will say I wrote for you guys back in 2020 and I wrote for commentary a bit about this. I didn't really see this as a national issue. I thought that Black Americans, maybe whites in response, were going to seize on it and say, look, you know, this is the conflict we've been warning you about. But the actual reality, there were 4 police officers that were involved in the Floyd stop. You had a black guy, you had a Hmong guy, Kung, I believe. You had 2 white guys. One of the white guys was in an interracial relationship. And the guy that they were arresting, I trained as a lawyer by background, so it's pretty easy to go look and see. Charged with armed robbery multiple times, abuse of women, although that's during one of the robberies. He also was a porn actor who used to play as the landlord in a series of underground videos. So like looking through it was sort of, well, it's unfortunate that anyone dies. This guy seems to be a career criminal. They're probably going to fry that cop. That was it. But the event itself, I thought was tragic. It was unfortunate.
So, Will, what were the conditions, do you think, that made this thing that you thought would not be a national issue? You thought it would bring out anti-racist activists and others from the African American community, but you didn't necessarily foresee that it would become a national issue and, in fact, a global issue. What were the conditions that allowed that to happen? How did this confrontation that we all saw, I guess that's a part of it, we saw the images, how did it become such a flashpoint in America? What contributed to that?
Yeah, there are a couple things there. First of all, I'm not sure why Black Lives Matter became the global movement that it did. So I have obviously friends in Europe, Asia, some in West Africa, and you saw marches in Stockholm, Sweden, Lagos, Nigeria. In Britain, things apparently were almost as crazy as they were here. Crowds in the street. So I'm not exactly sure why a lot of these countries, at least in Britain, there's a legacy of colonial warfare, which sometimes involved Black people. But I'm not sure what the Swedes really had to do with American Black issues at all. I think one thing that kind of plays into that was COVID-19. And we've all kind of memory hold how crazy the COVID response was, where the idea was that this was sort of the rage virus. It had a 5% fatality rate. And if we wanted to save seniors, everyone had to lock down. In the schools in Chicago, kids were still eating outdoors in, American Northern Hemispheric weather until 2023. So in 2020, a lot of people were actually still obeying the rules. They were in their houses. And all of a sudden, you had this excuse to go out and march. You saw people making out and dancing at these rallies. So I think that had a lot to do with it. A lot of people just sort of amorally continued living their lives, I will say. In red states, like we organized groups to shop for seniors and everyone just pretty much went on. About half the businesses were shut, but the jogging trails were full. People were playing tennis. But for those people that genuinely thought they were going to take a life by breathing, I think that this gave them an excuse to get out there. Like, I'm not just partying, I'm protesting racism, don't you see? And that explains much of it in Europe, much of it in America. The other thing in the States was that the BLM movement, Black Lives Matter, by this point had been going on for 6 or 7 years. So we kept seeing these cases. And George Floyd was kind of the final test case of, are we going to remake American policing? Are we going to keep affirmative action for 30 more years? Are we going to do this to race relations? But before that, we'd seen Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray. And I mean, some of these were genuine cases of police abuse, but I mean, it's important to recall, as we've both said for your publication, that a lot of them were the lionization of really unsympathetic people. I mean, Freddie Gray was a drug dealer who targeted young black kids. Michael Brown actually tried to kill a cop. I mean, so like his DNA is on the slide and the trigger guard of Darren Wilson's gun. So you had these two big men struggling over a pistol during a police stop of a criminal, and the cop shoots the guy. But all this had gone on for the better part of a decade. You know, I believe Trayvon Martin was shot in late 2011, 2012. The case became public. It might have all happened in 2012. But we've had 13 years of this now. You know, I wasn't done with grad school when this started. And I was mid-20s drinking beer. Like, this has gone on for a chunk of a lifetime. So that I think obviously was the background. That's the backstory there.
Yeah, I think the people tend to forget how important the COVID moment was to the Black Lives Matter explosion, particularly true in the UK, where people were locked down like they were everywhere else, and it became an opportunity for people to break out of their houses and take to the streets in huge numbers, which they'd been forbidden for doing for the previous few months. What about let's talk a little bit more about Black Lives Matter and what that represented. So the story they told about George Floyd's death, it instantly was folded into their broader narrative, which is that blacks in America are under attack by white cops. It's virtually a genocide. Black men in particular are being killed all the time. The George Floyd thing was a common event in the way that they told this story. How much of what they said was accurate, and how much was it just twisting this event to fit a narrative that pre-existed but was not necessarily based very much in truth?
Well, almost, in my opinion, almost none of Black Lives Matter's major claims were accurate, unless you're talking about something like there's generalized racism in society from whites and blacks. I mean, that's an unfortunate reality of all diverse countries. But I mean, the core argument was, yeah, there's a nearly genocidal wave of violence against black people from white law enforcement and from sort of vigilantes. I mean, George Zimmerman wasn't a police officer. He was the head of a neighborhood watch organization. And we saw all these other white people kind of shoehorned in that position and given these nicknames like Barbecue Becky, Pool Patrol Paula, Coupon Carl. We kind of forget this now because there's such a long, stupid period. But I mean, this went on for a while. This sort of everyone who was involved in a racial fist fight, especially on the white side, became a national character for a week or so. I mean, Amy Cooper got into an argument with a bird watcher in Central Park's Ramble while she was walking her dog, and became a national villain. And the dog was taken. The rescue organization for that particular breed came to her house and took back the dog. So the idea was that this harassment was constant, and police became the face of it, or the figurehead of it. You saw, Benjamin Crump, the well-known attorney, wrote a book called Open Season, The Legal Genocide of Colored People, and he argued there were tens of thousands of black males that were killed annually by whites or by the state. And I mean, again, obviously, you know the figures by now. Myself and a number of other people, Heather McDonald, even earlier, Manhattan Institute, dug into the records, and this resulted in there are now websites that have this. Washington Post has a good one that have this fully broken down. But it turned out that in 2015, for example, I mean, the total number of unarmed black men shot specifically by white cops was 17. Last year, the number of all unarmed black men shot by all cops was 12. So the core argument just was never true. And this became almost like the trans issue, in that there was this obvious reality that most kind of smart middle to up middle class people knew. I mean, the Washington Post isn't a small newspaper, but that you faced these very significant sanctions for pointing out. And this whole cadre of defenses grew up around it. Well, each police murder is worse than 50 regular murders because the honor of the state is being corrupted. And I think everyone knew it was sort of bullshit, but it continued for a long time. And again, that's the background. That's what BLM was. And no, I don't think the Kor claim was real.
Hi, it's Brendan here. I just wanted to remind you that you can still buy my latest book. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization, and it's available right now from Amazon. I'm really proud of this book. It is an unflinching account of how the West failed the moral test of 7th of October 2023, which of course is the day that Hamas and other militants invaded Israel and unleashed barbarism. The book documents in pretty chilling detail how activists, academics and others in the West ended up making excuses for Hamas's violence, ended up taking the side of the pogromists against the pogrom's victims, and ended up in the process turning their backs on the values of civilization. The book is fundamentally a call to arms for Western civilization. It makes the case for restoring Enlightenment values and standing with Israel while it's under attack by radical Islamists. I don't know if an author is allowed to describe his own book as essential reading, but I really do think it's essential reading. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization, and you can get your copy right now from Amazon.
So let's talk about the explosion of violence on the streets and the riots themselves, because, you know, I'm interested to know how that happened, and I'm also interested in reminding listeners of what it involved, because I'm sure many of them remember the scenes, but people can kind of tend to forget how serious these riots were. I mean, there were billions of dollars worth of damage, people died, it swept across the United States in numerous different cities. Tell us a bit about how bad things got in the weeks after George Floyd.
Well, I mean, the Black Lives Matter riots in general, but the George Floyd riots in particular were some of the biggest riots in at least U.S. history. I mean, my take would be that probably 50 to 60 people died. I believe it was the Daily Caller had a pretty good list of 32 very early on in the rioting and the street fighting. And then, again, this was very, very taboo. That kind of faded away. It was never updated. But I mean, dozens of people were killed. The general estimate is that $2 billion in damage was done. So a little less violent than the LA and Watts riots, although not by much, but much more destructive. I mean, in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, the Lake Street Business District, which is ironically traditionally the Asian and Black business district of the city, but it was burnt to the ground. I mean, almost the entire area was destroyed. And this happened in city after city, and this went on for a while. I mean, you saw the Kenosha riot where Kyle Rittenhouse became famous or notorious, where you literally had the left and the right fighting in the street with guns. I mean, there's a guy being chased by a mob, and he opens fire with a semi-automatic rifle. He hits 3 people. Now, it's interesting to note, as someone who's not unfunny in social life, that he shot at random into a crowd of leftists, and he hit a pedophile, a rapist, and a wife beater. I mean, or something like that, a burglar who was also beat his girlfriend. But at any rate, I mean, like, when you see that, when you actually see mobs from different races or political factions confronting each other with automatic weapons, I mean, you're in a pretty bad place. And I think after that, the USA has a bit of a cowboy tendency that we'll tolerate. But after that, I think people started cracking down. I mean, so you saw this rioting decrease steadily through 2021. And I mean, by 2022, 2023, we had returned to enforcing the law. And that's actually the thing that I had most worried about with this. So Jason Johnson wrote a piece for USA Today that later became a decent short academic piece, but he's a former police commissioner. And he pointed out that murders in the year after George Floyd's death surged to 1990s levels. We again got to 20,000 murders a year. I mean, we're a bigger country, but that's South African rates. You know, this is coming up from the mid-teens by 5, 6, 7,000 in a couple of years. But that reversed itself pretty rapidly. And I think social media, as much as I complain about like the racial fighting on Twitter and the idiotic debates about things like, should you sleep with your husband? I mean, I do think social media kind of illustrated what was going on. You saw all of this violence rapidly. You saw mobs of kids, more than 60% of them Black, breaking into stores, cracking open the watch case and running out with everything. And I think a lot of people just said, well, I'm not moving to the suburbs, you know, a different suburb. I mean, we've already seen flight in the 60s. we're gonna have to come back in and retake a lot of these areas, and that did happen. But the damage itself was very extensive. Last thing, I mean, there are parts of Louisville and Chicago now that haven't recovered. So people forget this about extreme social damage. Even the COVID lockdowns, which at least had the goal of saving lives, had this effect as well. If you're a small businessman and you own a pub, a neighborhood bar, or you own a barbershop or something like that, and your business is closed for a year, so you lose $85,000, and then it's set on fire, and it's going to cost $50,000 to repair it, you might never bring that back. So, I mean, there are storefronts in downtown Louisville where the Breonna Taylor riots were that used to house, not fine French bistros or anything, but good restaurants of different kinds, Thai or whatever, and they're just gone. And I mean, unless someone else buys that property, that's not going to be rehabilitated. So there was a pretty significant effect.
Yeah, it's that's a very good description of what was essentially civil strife in 21st century America. I mean, people with guns on the streets fighting each other and destroying property. I mean, they were extraordinary scenes. Who was involved in these riots? You said there that 60% or so were black kids. Obviously, they were very pissed off with various things. But who else was involved? Because, you mentioned the Watts riots in Los Angeles in 1965, which was primarily an uprising of black people against what they thought were often racist practices by the LAPD and other institutions in Los Angeles society. It's often referred to as the Watts uprising. It's seen as an important black uprising. Were the BLM riots different? Because lots of the clips we tended to see online there were lots of white kids. There were these kind of TikTok revolutionaries. There was Antifa was on the streets. There was that kind of weird leftist element that you alluded to. What else was involved? Who was involved in these riots, and what was pushing them, do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, so a majority of the looters, when I said 60%, that's the figure for organized store looting and all that. The rest of that would be whites and Hispanics, I guess. Asians commit very few crimes in the USA and most other places, including Asia. But Asians in the American sense. But the riots themselves were incredibly integrated. They were majority white, probably about 70% from the arrest figures I've seen from Portland, Minneapolis. So you had a mix of, you had some hood kids out there just to fight with the police, but you had a lot of organized quasi-revolutionaries that were going to, the thing with the BLM protests, people always said was that they were peaceful during the day. So I teach at a state college that also has a historically black component, and a lot of our kids took signs and went to the Breonna Taylor protests. And during the day, it was mostly college men and women. I mean, literally people were drinking ice cream softies and waving the signs at the police. There were camps on the lawn in central Louisville. But the character started to change as night got closer pretty consistently. When you had a whole bunch of people, quasi-radicals, goons who thought looting might happen, street people who just live in the area, kind of going to the same site. I saw the same dynamic a decade before with Occupy, by the way. Like, it's very difficult if you have a street-based movement that has people living out on the street to kind of avoid the street. It becomes a place where people go to almost party. I mean, there's usually food available. There's usually drugs available. There's an automatic opponent, the police that are put out in cordon around you. So, I mean, a lot of the protests turned into riots. The rioters, I guess you had the Antifa types, that comes out of Black Bloc. The people who started protesting the World Trade Organization and so on now 20 years ago with the masks on and bike locks. A very diverse group if you're looking at the rioters themselves. I mean, that's pretty much it. A lot of white guys, some black guys. The crazy thing about this, since a lot of the tougher and more revolutionary fighters were white, and a lot of the areas being protested in were black, was that more than once you saw white guys setting black businesses on fire while chanting things like Black Lives Matter. I mean, that's definitely what went on in the Lake Street district, where the mob was carrying banners that said BLM on them and so on. And you saw these black-owned hardware stores or Asian-owned sushi joints on fire. I mean, one police station was burnt, but that's not a governmental area. There weren't embassies or something like that that were being targeted. It was just normal people's normal businesses.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the most striking things about the riots, where you had these white kids professing to be acting on behalf of black communities and to be caring for black people, and yet taking actions that was very often destructive for those black communities. What was being expressed by that element on the riots, the kind of pseudo-revolutionary, the white kids playing up, setting things on fire, going out at night and knocking things down, what was being expressed by that? Because it seems to me that if you look back to the 1960s, and it wasn't only the Watts riots, you know, in the late 60s there were black uprisings in many different parts of America. Watts, Detroit, Newark, Harlem. I mean, there were numerous riots which were quite clearly expressions of frustration, I guess, with what they considered to be the slowness of civil rights changes and the slowness of the gains that had been promised to them by those movements of the 1960s. They were frustrated with how things were going in society, and it's pretty clear to see what the riots were about. It was an expression of rage with that state of society. What was being expressed, do you think, in the BLM riots 5 years ago? What were those white kids trying to get across? What do you think they were saying with the violence that they carried out?
Well, I think one thing that's interesting is that now today in the USA, you have a more integrated kind of street culture and working class. I suspect you probably see this in the UK as well. Um, and I mean, there actually is a bunch of social media pages that have names like UK, YOOKAY aesthetic that are, you know, picture, you see like 3 white guys, 3 black guys, and a recent immigrant from Somalia with tracksuits on and so on. I mean, like, we have a lot of that as well. And I think a lot of those people just went out together, if that makes sense, in some of these mid-sized cities like Minneapolis or Kenosha. So I don't know if there was a deep point being made beyond we're still angry, and by this point the hood's pretty integrated in Middle America. I think that the cause of the anger is actually interesting, because the root cause of American racial anger, in my opinion, is that there are still large performance gaps between groups. So every time I sit down in my full academic Don role and I actually seriously interview people and talk about this, I'm doing some of that for my next book, Confidently Wrong, right now. But what you see is that people will say things like, and this would be a black or Appalachian guy in Kentucky, look at this neighborhood they give us. Look at this school they give us. What could explain the quality of test scores in this school if it wasn't for discrimination? And I think in the context I just gave, it's fairly easy to rebut, because black people and Appalachian citizens are of different races. So, I mean, if things are looking similar across an integrated area, you can say, well, how much of this is cultural? Would an emphasis on fatherhood or an emphasis on better teachers, less drug use, would that improve the situation? And I think very few people can deny that it would. But at the national level, the upper middle class American convention is that all these gaps are due to racism. And since there are a bunch of gaps, the black homicide rate is 7 times the white rate, so on, the idea is that there must be a bunch of racism. So people almost keep looking for racism. The reality, of course, is that more black people are working or lower class in the USA than white people. And that has something to do with past racism, but it also has a lot to do with welfare policy, the collapse of the family, so on. And there's fairly little active agentic racism. There are a lot of idiots on Twitter and Facebook of all colors, but there aren't a lot of bosses that will refuse to hire a salesman or a stockbroker because of their race. I've never seen that in those environments in my entire life, really, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions. So there are a lot of gaps. We attribute them to racism. There's not a lot of active racism. So people kind of look around for it. And you have these ideas like stereotype threat, which is the claim that the gap in test scores between whites and blacks, and now sometimes between whites and blacks and Hispanics and Asians and whites, whatever, is caused by subtle prejudice on the part of test administrators or a fear on the part of lower scoring groups that they're going to do badly on the test. And the police thing became part of this general idea that the bigots are out there somewhere. So for about a decade, the racism du jour was, well, you white boys, quote unquote, don't understand what it's like to deal with these police that are murdering us. And then we looked at the data on police homicides. As I said, it turns out there are 10 or 12 unarmed black men killed every year, less than 100 unarmed men of all races. So that one faded away. But I mean, I'm sure we're going to replace it with a new excuse is too simple, but a new form of explanatory racial prejudice pretty soon.
That leads me on nicely to my next question, which is, to what extent might we say that explosion of violence in 2020 was the militant expression of some pretty mainstream ideas? And by mainstream, I mean ideas that are in the academy, they've been on campuses for a long time. Many people in the political and media elites adhere to these ideas, which is primarily, I guess it gets bundled up as critical race theory. The idea that America is institutionally racist. It was born in the sin of slavery. That's the original sin. It will never be washed away. There has been, as you know more than most, there has been the growth of this fatalistic culture of race obsession in the United States in recent years, which is quite influential in policy circles, in intellectual circles. To what extent might we say that the BLM riots, even if in a pretty unconscious way, was an expression of that kind of fatalism and this belief that racism is rampant in the US when the evidence, as you say, suggests that it isn't?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And the answer is almost certainly that was the motivator. One thing that we're doing in the USA and also in Britain that's completely insane when you think about it, even from an intelligent, amoral perspective, is teaching people negative propaganda. I mean, so on a lot of public issues, there are actually two sides to the debate. I mean, was British colonialism good or bad? I'd say overall good, actually. I mean, if you look at the developmental paths of regions like South India before and after or whatnot, but I would certainly understand a forward cast Hindu saying, and no, it wasn't. We had trend lines were going up and before they arrived, whatever. But the point is that you can have these debates. We have decided on almost every one of these points, like were the Indian Wars justified? I mean, almost always in the United States. I mean, if someone breaks a border and kidnaps a bunch of your people as sex slaves, you're probably going to start a war with them. So if you actually unpack the reality of history, everyone behaved badly in contemporary terms, but I don't think the West stands out for any unique dishonor compared to the Arab world, the great native tribes, the Chinese, the Mongols. But anyway, I could go on a long-winded dinner party ramble about this. The point is that we, for whatever reason, have decided to teach almost the most negative perspective on all of these things to children in our countries. And that's an insane thing to do. Logically, if you're running a school system, there seem to be two paths. One, you could do what the Chinese do, which is teach positive lies. So, I mean, you have a big picture of John Bull in front of the classroom and everyone sings Rule Britannia at the start of the day or the American equivalent, and you talk about how great you are. Or two, you explain the unvarnished truth. I mean, this is what the Americans have done, the Romans, the Chinese, the Brits, the Ottomans, the Zulus. Some was good, some was bad. Teaching people that their own society is uniquely evil is an extremely stupid thing to do. And it's something that only a few countries have adopted only in the modern era. I'm rambling a bit here. The point is that, yes, of course, the idea that American society is extraordinarily oppressive toward Black people is an underlying anger in a lot of these debates. And Black people aren't any more wicked or malicious than any other people. The average African American goes about his day, plays football with his high school teammates, preps for college, and we have a whole network of historically Black schools alongside the quote-unquote PWIs, just lives life. But there's a weird kind of worm that's been planted, which is the idea that if you have a rude interaction, that's probably racism. If you don't get a job, where in fact, because of affirmative action, you have a slight advantage, that's probably racism, so on. And yeah, every so often that bubbles over and we see this racial violence. And in fact, we see that at a lower level pretty often. I mean, one of the things that I looked at for one of my books was rates of interracial crime. And they're pretty low. I mean, they're about 600,000 index or felony level violent interracial crimes in the USA in a typical year. And there are 12 million, say, total index crimes, which includes robbery, rape, so on. Also a few of the most serious property crimes, burglary. So you got about 5%. But within that data set, I mean, about 80% of them were Black on white. There are more white people. They have more money on average. But you have to think that part of that is this animus of I'm being held down. I know it. I'm repressed. The reason I'm poor, the reason I'm a robber is racism. And I'm going to take that out on these people. And creating the set of conditions where people believe that is an extremely illogical thing to do, all kind of moral analyses aside.
If you're a regular listener to this show or a regular reader of Spiked, why not become a Spiked supporter? Spiked Supporters is our thriving community of people who donate to Spiked. Anyone who gives £5 or more a month or £50 or more a year can become a Spiked supporter and get access to lots of exciting perks. Spiked supporters can comment on articles, get free and discounted tickets to events, get a discount on all items in our shop, and bookmark articles as you browse. This is our way of saying thank you to all of you who fund our work. Spiked is completely free, and yet you still hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that anyone, anywhere can read us and listen to us. We're incredibly grateful for your generosity. If you don't give to Spiked yet, now is the perfect time to start. Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to set up your donation and your Spiked supporters account. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's such a self-destructive ideology or form of propaganda to be foisting onto society. It's bound to store up these kinds of tensions, which will occasionally explode in the way they did in 2020. One thing I find depressing about the fatalistic read on American race relations right now, which I guess is expressed by writers like Ta-Nehisi Coates and others as well, is that it completely whitewashes, for want of a better word, the great gains made by various figures in American history. You know, from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Tubman to W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, whoever else one might name. These are people who said things and did things which palpably improved life for Black Americans, and I would say for America more broadly. You know, there was then, even though there were incredibly violent periods that all those people experienced, there was a belief to a certain extent in the promise of America, which they felt wasn't being lived up to. Whereas the new racial politics, it seems to me, in Ta-Nehisi Coates' work and a lot of the writing you see in the mainstream media about these issues, is not about the promise of America, but the nightmare of America and the unchanging nature of racial hatred in American society. And that kind of fatalism erases history and makes the future look incredibly bleak, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good analysis. And it's also, I think it's important to call this stuff out. Like the Ta-Nehisi Coates take on American history is extraordinarily disingenuous and largely wrong. And not all that brilliant, not all that quote unquote high IQ, in my opinion. So to some extent, you have some of the most pampered people in history. I mean, upper middle class, college graduates from groups that are receiving formal affirmative action right now, talking about how their lives are horrible and they have no chance to succeed. And it's to the point where it's become kind of a running joke from aware urban whites and other people who move in sort of just integrated normal circles. You know, these petted, cosseted, feminist dance therapy majors are once again suffering. You know, that is not realistic. And I think at this point, I think a lot of people in the Elon Twitter era, you know, are just sort of openly saying that. But I mean, in terms of your actual practical question about are American race relations terrible in any real offline measurable sense? I mean, no, we've both talked about this in pretty big forums before. 7 of the 10 wealthiest groups in the United States right now are non-white. You could say 8 if you add South Africans, who are a mix of Black South Africans, Zulus, Osha, Boers, English. But just even without that, you've got Indian Americans, Filipino Americans, Chinese Americans. I think Nigerians made the cut, although near the bottom of that top 10. But that's the reality of today. And you might say, well, you know, those groups experience white supremacy differently from Black Americans or something. But you have to ask that question of why. Why would a Nigerian or an Indian Dravid be treated any better by a bigot than a native-born Black guy, especially one with my kind of skin tone? And the answer is, well, logically, they wouldn't be. There's got to be something else that's allowing these people to compete very well in our currently non-prejudiced society. And you can actually just look at the historical moments that led to that. I mean, in 1954, when you talk about the trajectory of American history kind of curving up toward the positive, I mean, in 1954, we formally desegregated the country in the only region that remained segregated at bayonet point. In 1964, we passed the Civil Rights Act, which makes it civilly and often criminally illegal to discriminate on the basis of race and sex, religion, ethnicity. 1967, if you want to date affirmative action to the Philadelphia Plan, since then, we've had positive discrimination in favor of minorities. And it's really astonishing how rarely, until quite recently, this was just pointed out. Now we're swinging kind of hard to the right, which I mentioned in my article, and that has its own downsides, although we're both on the right or the center right. But for a very long time, I mean, just saying, well, we've had 60 years of affirmative action. Even speaking to my own community, what are you guys doing wrong? That was very, very much frowned on. But that is actually the real state of affairs. I mean, that is what's been the case for decades. So no, Ta-Nehisi Coates is not oppressed. I mean, Ibrahim Kendi is not oppressed. Ibrahim Kendi, the last line here, but the good doctor was given $10 million, maybe 20, during all of this, and encouraged to set up a scientific institute for the study of racism and anti-racism. And as I understand it, he produced 2 papers and the institute quietly closed down, which is what happened to a lot of this stuff. But the reality there is very different from what was publicly said.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you, in fact, about Ibrahim X. Kendi and Robin DAngelo. You mentioned these people in your piece for Spite, and many listeners will be familiar with them. Ibrahim X. Kendi wrote about how to be an anti-racist and made a lot of money from speeches and writing. Robin DAngelo writes about the problem of whiteness, the inherent racism of white people and so on, white fragility, and she made a lot of money as well. They became kind of high priests of the racial fatalism, kind of high priests of that kind of very depressing view of the permanence of racial division, that kind of neo-segregationist mindset. What's happening with those kinds of people now? Because they really had a moment in the sun and they did well and they became very influential. But it does seem to me that their star has faded to a certain extent, and there is now more openness to ridiculing some of the depressing ideas they were putting forward. What's going on with that? I guess you might call it the racial grift. What's happening there?
Well, I mean, I think that there are different levels to it. At one level, what's happening is that these people are doing very well and living in their mansions. I mean, again, Ibrahim Kendi was given $10 million. I mean, I think he only paid himself. He was fairly ethical, less than $1 million of that, but that's over 3 or 4 years. I mean, it's a pretty good salary. He's writing his books on the side. Patrice Kor is the founder of Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, the big BLM organization. As I recall, bought 7 houses. I might be off by a house or 2, but she's a pretty good real estate speculator. She bought all these mansions, and I will note mostly white areas. So she's assumed living there with her girlfriend. Robin DAngelo obviously sold White Fragility, major lecture tour for a couple of years. It's something like the 30th best-selling book of all time. So behind the Bible and Harry Potter, but, ahead of most of the work from Dickens or Shakespeare. So you can't help but laugh at it. I mean, on the one hand, they're all living in a princely fashion. I think in terms of their ideas, though, those have been pretty thoroughly debunked. And again, I think as with the thing that keeps coming to my mind is transgenderism as a comparador. But as with that, when you look back, it's pretty hard to believe people publicly pretended to agree with this stuff. So, I mean, Ibrahim Kendi's core idea is that when you see a gap between groups of the kind we've just been describing, the only 2 possible explanations are racism, no matter how subtle, or even though he doesn't like to say it exactly like this, genetic inferiority. That's what he means by some people are worse than others, some people are unchangeably worse, there's just something wrong with some people, so on. And the problem with that is that it's just wrong. It's incredibly simplistic. Just to give one variable, the modal average age for a black man, the one I always use, is 27. White guy's 58. Difference even at the mean is 10 or 11 years. So, I mean, obviously, if you're 50, you're going to have more money and commit fewer crimes than a guy who's 20. I mean, so before talking about anything controversial, tested IQ, history of racism, you can just say, well, this is a younger, more religious Southern population, so there's a 18-year or whatever it is age gap. I mean, that's it. That's a third of the difference right there. So Kendi's ideas, I think if you're good enough with the computer to use Excel, much less Stata, never made a ton of sense. They were just sort of mandatory you agree with them. Robin DAngelo, pretty much the same. Robin DAngelo, by the way, reminds me of an entertainingly crazy person you might go out with in grad school. Like, she seems pretty funny. I mean, but like the core, the basis of her book seems to be personal worry as a working class Italian American person about whether she's racist. So there are all these incredibly awkward scenes in the book where she describes actually going out on a dinner date and thinking of black jokes for some reason. I think her date was black. Or she'll say things like, we all know that everyone's family, white or black, tells terrible racist jokes when they're alone. I just recall reading through this and saying, well, mine doesn't really. I mean, I don't know, I've made a couple buddies like that, but not many. It's so a lot of that seemed to be kind of a personal retrospective on her own feelings. And again, the core thesis, which is that white people are prone to take offense when they're insulted, is true for all groups. I mean, you'd find there to be a lot of black fragility. If someone put up one of the Benin bronzes next to Michelangelo's David and said, B plus versus A or something like that. I mean, everyone has that tendency to defend their own group, so forth. So again, I think as the veil of lunacy faded, people in psychology started saying that. There have been a couple basic tests of black fragility and so on. So a lot of this is kind of moving toward the trash heap, but it's doing so after being very profitably rewarded for a long period of time. I think it's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was on TV once with Robin DAngelo, and I remember saying to her, well, I don't have those feelings or thoughts that you're describing. I don't make racist jokes, and I don't know many people who do. So yeah, it was that kind of personal neurosis in some ways dressed up as political analysis. It was a very odd time. We've talked there about so-called social justice warriors or woke writers. I don't know what we're supposed to call them these days. But I did want to ask you a little bit about the online right as well, because it does seem to me that kind of the segregationist mindset is not only visible amongst the social justice set who promote this idea, sometimes unwittingly, that blacks and whites will never really understand each other. You need to stay in your own lane. You shouldn't do cultural appropriation. You shouldn't step on each other's toes, play it carefully. So they promote a kind of segregationist view, perhaps without meaning to. But you see the growth of that segregationist mindset in sections of the online right too. And one of the trends of our time is for these people on the internet to constantly put out videos showing a black guy smashing up a McDonald's or getting into a scrap with the police or doing something else that is antisocial or criminal, and then holding that up as proof of why it's impossible to live with these people. There is a growth of a kind of nasty racism in those sections of the online right. How much of that do you think is an outgrowth of the BLM moment as well, or a reaction against it? And what you end up with, depressingly, is really two forms of racism: woke racism on one side and just old-fashioned racism on the other.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. Obviously, if you're not a coward and your opponent keeps insulting you, you're probably going to start insulting them, and then the two of you are going to have an unpleasant argument or fight. I mean, I think that's one of the most predictable things you see in social and workplace dynamics. And we've both been bosses. It's extremely predictable what causes it, what triggers it. Yeah, that's what you're seeing on the right. So what do I think about this? I mean, I think it's the same thing as social justice, sometimes even a bit more obnoxious. And you're seeing it quite a bit. I mean, the other day, I'm pretty active on X, on Twitter, and I reposted a comment from a guy who calls himself like ancestral virility or something like that. But it was a white guy, and he said, I understand actually that Asians, Nigerians, Jews, all of these groups do pretty well in the USA. So kicking them out or something like that, if it's possible, it'd actually be a major economic hit. And I was like, okay, fair enough. But what's the pro-white point? And then he said, but that's fine. I'd rather live in a slum among kingly white people than in some suburb next to a guy named Muhammad. And I recall thinking about this, and there are specific questions about Muslim immigration, depending on level of fanaticism and so on. But no, I mean, I've seen a great deal of slums as a Chicagoan who lives in Appalachia. I would much rather live in Scarsdale next to Muhammad, the doctor, than in a trailer park. And I think we're seeing a lot of this foolishness that basically is just old school racism. I actually put up a poll online asking people, which would you pick? And among whites, about 30% by this point said, I'd pick a poorer ethno state. I'm tired of the constant ethnic conflict. Now, I have a right-wing page that's probably not typical, but you're seeing this, and it is a real problem. The one question I do have about it is how much of it is real? In the sense that these people aren't visible offline in the way that Robin DAngelo, Ibrahim, Kendi, all these people were. So, like, obnoxious left-wing racists, you can verify they exist. You saw all the cities on fire. Obnoxious right-wing racists, a lot of them seem to be guys on Facebook. And you wonder where, so like the few times, I'm not a doxer, the few times I've gotten curious enough to investigate someone, one of the guys was from Malaysia. One of them was from Lebanon. The people behind sites with names like Patriot, Red Hawk Media, if you ever look up that brand, are always like Abdul, Anshizazar, Aziz. So I don't know. Obviously there are a lot of working class British and American kids that are following these pages and that are saying things like, yeah, I'd like an all white country again. But I think that the initiators of a lot of this stuff are not real people, or are guys LARPing, or are actual foreign agents. I will say, like, when you see like Israel and Qatar having a virtual war in the comments, I do have to wonder how many people at Loyola University Chicago have this level of information about the tactical military positions of those two countries. And you see the Qatar stuff a lot more on the right. If you wanted to cause conflict and dissensus in a powerful rival, that would actually be a very simple way to do it. You'd set up a page called Blacks Taking L's, which has 180,000 followers on Twitter, and then a page called I Expose White Pedos and Racists, which has 160,000 followers, and you would just sort of tag team back and forth in the comments of these two entities, and you'd convince a lot of people that the other team is made up entirely of bigots. So again, I don't have a high tolerance for racism. My one thing with this is, like, if you're totally anon, I don't know where you are, there's a pretty good chance you're in Bangalore. And that's why you don't seem to like whites or blacks. You know what I mean? So how much of it is real? That's the question.
Yeah, I think that is a good question. I wanted to ask you about a couple more things. The first thing is about the global impact of BLM, the global impact of the death of George Floyd and the events in America that followed it. You mentioned earlier there were BLM protests in Stockholm, a pretty white city. There were BLM protests in London, and I remember one scene where these kids protesting were mimicking the BLM slogan with their hands up saying don't shoot, which was very bizarre because our cops don't even have guns, so it was not a prospect that anyone was going to be shot. But that mimicry of the American style. And we saw Aboriginal people in Australia marching under the BLM banner. I mean, it really was, in one way, it was an extraordinary exporting, I guess, of American cultural power. I mean, huge corporations promoted BLM. The social media oligarchs promoted it endlessly. In a way, it reflected a kind of culture of self-loathing and confusion within the US itself, but its global impact, I guess, might speak to that kind of cultural power America enjoys across the world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you don't like to think that America's primary export today would be, wokeism and military weaponry or something like that. But a lot of the stuff, I mean, we don't make that many Cadillacs anymore, certainly not in Detroit. So yeah, when the USA does something, when other major powers, including Britain and Japan, do things, the world often responds. I mean, that's why you see people in goth lolly, quote unquote, fashion with Hello Kitty backpacks walking around in Chicago, because someone in another major country made that, quote unquote, cool. We do at least that much as Yanks, as Americans. So, yeah, I mean, I think the ideas behind BLM, that the rich man is oppressing you, that has a racial element in many countries, so on down the line. Yeah, I think that appealed in France. I think that appealed in Australia, which has a large population of people that claim to be Australian Aboriginals. I mean, everyone I've ever met who identified with that background was blonde. But anyway, whatever. I mean, so they had a lot of people that would get out there in the streets. They also have a Senegalese and Sudanese immigrant community right now. So around the world, people took on these themes of sort of class warfare. The early part of BLM was also the Bernie Sanders and AOC era. It was the tail end of Occupy, but beyond the class, the racial conflict, it's also just one of the things that a lot of people struggle to understand about crime is that if you're young and especially male, crime is fun. Like, it's fun to fight with your high school rivals as long as no one dies. It's fun to have sex outside in the bushes. It's fun to rob annoying rich people in your community. So the whole element of this, like, I am a revolutionary LARPer, proved to have real global appeal. I actually think the USA in particular has to answer for some of this, and I think there's going to be a real backlash to this kind of thing pretty soon, because the export of contemporary Western progressivism is not something many people want. Even now in the Scandinavian countries, in Britain and Germany, you're seeing a backlash to it. You're seeing a strong and I think deserved backlash against all this immigration, so on down the line. And a lot of people are saying, these American ideas of racial guilt that come out of Jim Crow, why did we ever listen to them over here when we never had a background comparable to this? So I think that's already happened, but this is also going to take place with gay rights, for example, where you see the pride flag flying over the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, and you just know that, like, at some point soon, as these nations continue to rise, that's going to become an issue. That's going to be a sticking point. They're going to ask that be taken down. So, yes, weird wokeness is currently an American cultural export. The world kind of experimented with it. I think most of the world is saying they want a refund on that product. The transgender idea itself is something that spread globally out of American academia. There's a debate in America about whether it's feminist academia or kind of a weird group of post-Kinsey males, let's say. But definitely that hit Europe pretty hard. The UK at one point was one of the global leaders in transing the little kids. And now, as I understand, the Brits are pulling back. Like, the Tavistock Clinic shut down. J.K. Rowling has become kind of the global leader of the movement against this. So, yeah, a U.S. export, one that people now seem to be rejecting.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, Britain is known as Turf Island, and Turf Island is we're very proud to have risen up against the neo-imperialism of the trans ideology. So we've pushed back on that very hard. Okay, well, my last question for you is on the backlash, which you described very well there. And in your piece for us, you talked about how there has been a move to the right as a response to all the BLM mayhem. And you mentioned, the significant numbers of African-American men and Latino people and, of course, the white working classes who voted for Trump last year and put him back into the White House. How much do you think that will fix the problem? The fact that Trump is there, he's dismantling many elements of DEI, he's pushing back on woke, trans stuff, racial fatalism, he's telling off various museums in Washington, D.C. for their kind of self-loathing in relation to American history. Do you think this is a sustainable revolt against the woke mindset and against the BLM moment, or will there be a backlash against the backlash? How do you see things playing out in the next couple of years?
Well, I think it's potentially very sustainable. I mean, and when I mentioned that American race relations on the ground are pretty functional, I mean, the Trump vote is pretty good evidence of that. I mean, the worry in a multiracial country is that you'll have ethnic parties a la South Africa. I mean, they have the EFF, Economic Freedom Fighters, which is basically for poor, unemployed Black people, generally from the less successful tribes in the country. You have the ANC, which is the mainstream Zulu and Xhosa party. Well, actually, it's the mainstream Xhosa party. You also have the KwaZulu-Natal. There's a Zulu party. I mean, you have the DA, which is considered to be the party of rich Blacks and British whites. You have Afrikaner separatists in regions like Oranje. So very often in places like that, an election just becomes a referendum on whose population is growing fastest. Like, are the rural whites going to be able to outbreed the ex-urban blacks and get, one more candidate in from that region? And in the USA, we're actually not doing that. I'm pleased to see. I mean, there's been a huge debate since Rui Teixeira's The Emerging Democratic Majority about whether demography basically is destiny. Like, if the country becomes 15% black and 20% Hispanic, is conservatism over? And the Trump numbers say basically no. I mean, Trump won 54% of Hispanic men, 46% of Hispanics overall. That actually might just be Hispanic women because he nearly split Hispanics. He won about a third of young black men. Although I will say 94% of black women voted against the Donald. So you're seeing this male-female split with a lot of this. But in terms of the good news, I mean, he won almost 40% of Asians, 65% of natives, 50+% of whites. So I think in a situation like that, where most people are voting for, in practice, a center-right Republican candidate, and that's the case across racial lines, I mean, I think that's obviously a good thing for race relations. And Trump, I think the appeal of Trump is that he says things that are very obvious, bluntly. So, I mean, Trump signed a bill or an executive order saying, well, there won't be males in women's sports because they have penises. I mean, it's just the sort of obvious thing that I think everyone knows to be true, but that, again, became very awkward for a while to say. Trump striking back against the DEI regime. And I mean, he's doing it actually for a big blustering guy, a pretty intelligent, subtle way. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, in 1964, signed an executive order saying that the federal government and other major governmental players won't do business with companies that don't practice affirmative action, basically, that don't have proportional representation of different racial groups throughout their business population. And that's how affirmative action works, by the way, for the Brits who might not be aware of how U.S. positive discrimination functions. Basically, you have to have a proportional representation of each ethnic group. I mean, you can have like 5% less whites. They don't enforce that too seriously. But you have to have basically proportional representation of each ethnic group in your population if you're a large business. And a university is much the same. The thing is that the different groups perform very differently in the United States. So in practice, to get representative numbers of Asians who score about a 1250 on the SAT, and Native Americans who score under blacks and Hispanics, it's about a 912. For both of those groups to be at your university at a 7% and 3% or whatever rate, you have to spot the Native kids 300 points on the test. There's similar systems that work in corporate America, so on. The point is, though, that this had been the law since the president basically snuck it through, again, now 60 years ago, and Trump got rid of this. So the federal government now doesn't have an affirmative action requirement for suppliers. The reason that almost every big company would try to meet that requirement, by the way, is that selling into the government is one of the most profitable things you can do. The assumption is that the process will be slow, it'll be cumbersome, you'll be overpaid, you'll be able to bill a mass number of hours. So everyone wants to do this just because of what governments are here and globally. And now that no longer exists. You've seen fair admissions on the court side, most university affirmative actions unconstitutional. So I think Trump actually is making some moves toward kind of a colorblind society, believe it or not. And a lot of people voted for that, and they voted for that across color lines. So I do think that in reality, you'll see a lot of this with about half the people of all shades voting for the pachyderms and about half the people of all shades voting for the Dems. And I mean, then you'll log into Twitter and you'll see people screaming racial insults at each other. But again, I don't think that's going to be all that representative of the future. If Trump accomplishes what he sets out to during his term, then perhaps you have Vance in there and so on.
Will, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.